Welcome to Chapter 10, Performance Management and Appraisal. By the end of this chapter, you should be able to identify why performance management is necessary, distinguish among the three types of performance information, explain the differences between administrative and developmental uses, of performance appraisal, describe the advantages and disadvantages of 360-degree appraisals, discuss the importance of training managers and employees on performance appraisal and give examples of rater errors, identify several concerns about appraisal feedback and ways to make it more effective. So, let's look at the difference between performance management and appraisal. Performance management is a series of activities that are designed to ensure that your organization gets the performance it needs from its employees. The appraisal is the process of determining how well your employees do their jobs relative to the standard that was set by the company and communicated to the team members. You see the difference? One is a set of activities that are going to ensure that you can get the job done. The other one's going to appraise how well you did your job compared to the standards set for you. The nature of performance management, there is an effective system that would make clear what you expect from your team members. It provides the information to your team members about performance. It identifies the areas of success and where development is needed. And it's going to document performance for personal records. There's a linkage between performance management, the performance, the outcomes, and the results. And they're linked with the organizational strategies and the performance of the employee. And here's figure 10.1 that shows you this linkage. From the strategies into managing performance, that employee then does the job right or wrong, well or not. There's the outcome, and from there, what are the rewards or the punishment for their performance outcome? What are the results that impact the organization? Were the goals met or not? Was the employee satisfied or not? And then it goes back through. When we look at our cultural differences globally, some cultures find it uncommon for managers to rate employees or to give direct feedback. In some cultures, younger subordinates don't engage in joint discussions with their managers because of the age difference. In some cultures, criticism from superiors is viewed as negative rather than as being useful feedback. You have to take into consideration that every culture is different. And we're not just speaking about racial cultures. It can be based on regions of the country. It could be based on religion. It can be based on so many other factors. Figure 10.2 shows you the components of performance-focused cultures. They have clear expectations, goals, and deadlines. The appraisal and employee performance is very detailed. Feedback on performance is clear and concise. Managers and employees training as needed. And there are consequences, positive and negative, for performance. That is, whether you perform well or poorly, there's a consequence tied to it. To ID and measure performance, there are certain criteria. There has to, of course, be presence on the job. You have to be there in order to get the job done. There is a quality and quantity of output, the timeliness of the output, the efficiency and effectiveness of the work completed. Job duties. These are the elements of a job as identified by the description posted. What an organization's paying you to do are your duties that are outlined in that description. The weights tied to that are used to show the relative importance of different duties in a job. You can see if something is weighted by the intensity of the workload, of who you're reporting to, the frequency of the report, who you're responsible for, what clients you have. Are they high level quality clients? Are those the top generators of the company's revenue? Is it being driven by these clients? And are you the person that they're in contact with? There shows you the various weights. Figure 10.3 shows you the types of performance information: trait based, behavior based, results based. Traits based are less useful. It's your attitude, the values. From there, it grows into your customer satisfaction and verbal persuasion. What is the most useful information is the results base. What's coming from it? Is there improved quality? The number of units produced, the cost reduction, the sales volume. But do you see how the traits and the behavior factor into that? So it's not to say that they're not valuable, but when you're looking at the information that comes from performance, you get greater data from what results come from it than you would of saying, wow, we have an employee with great attitude. Great. How does that translate to performance? That only translate to performance based on the job they do, based on the results that we receive. Our standards are the defined expectation of the work produced. They should be realistic. You should be able to measure them and track them, and they should be clearly understood. The employee should know clearly what it means, how to achieve it, and the organization should be able to clearly articulate it. You should be able to ensure that everyone involved knows the levels of accomplishment that's expected, and you can be able to see these standards and be able to visualize the performance both numerically and non-numerically. However, non-numerical standards can be very challenging. So understanding that the if you put them on a split a page and you wrote on one side numerical and on the other side non-numerical, of course the non-numerical is going to be a much shorter list, but you should be able to have both sides. When we look at examples of the standards for a weight person, this is figure 10.4. You have your performance level of superior, acceptable, needs improvement. This is a server in a restaurant. Then the demonstrated ability. Superior performance level. This person visits the table quickly after the guests are seated. They take the order exactly when guests are ready. They serve the drinks and food immediately after items are prepared. They clear that table. They present the check immediately after the meal is complete. What is deemed acceptable? You as the server, you visit the table in a reasonable time after the guests are seated. You take their order in a timely manner. You serve their drinks and foods after items are prepared. You clear the table and you present a check after meal is complete. This right here, the last one, is where you need to intervene because your server needs help. They visit the table when there's time to do so. They take order when it's ready. They serve the drinks and food after other duties are completed. Not when the food is prepared and ready to be served, but after they've completed other duties. They clear the table and present check after they service all their other tables. They need help. There needs to be intervention. You need to come in and show them the right way. So we look at a service business in this example of performance metrics, and it can be difficult because the services are individualized for the customers, what their needs are. And so there's a great variation in the services that can be offered. And quality is subjective. What I think is quality can be a different view of what you think is quality. And so measuring a service business can be very difficult compared to a product based business. Some common sources of differences in performance can be the differences in our service agreements, the work volume, if there's a difference between the equipment or the infrastructure being used, and then, of course, labor cost differences regionally. So, how do we go? There's a performance appraisal. What is it all about? What is the purpose? What does it do? It helps to assess your performance as an employee. It gives you a platform for feedback. It helps when we're trying to pay you to, whether it's a wage, a salary, a promotion, um, um, a bonus. It helps to identify your strengths and weaknesses, provide answers to any questions you have about the job, the work. It helps to improve performance. When we look at appraisals and ethics, it's huge because a lot of people aren't focusing on ethics when they're associating them with the jobs and the employees that perform these jobs. Tying them together is one way to emphasize this. Tying these together allows you to make sure that performance is not being, it is not a bias tied to it. So when you have codes of conduct, it can be useful as a guideline for ethical behavior. It can help with training to teach important ethical values and also communicating and promoting an ethical culture. Figure 10.5, there is showing you the uses of these performance appraisals for administrative actions, but also developmental actions. Administrative actions, if you're dismissing someone from work, right? You're transferring them to another site, or developmental actions could be coaching or mentoring, identifying strengths and weaknesses. The decisions that we make with this process, we can design appraisal systems where we can show the responsibilities and both the informal and systematic processes. And then we can also outline the timing of appraisals, when they're done, when that feedback is provided, when the next one will be done, when we then review prior appraisals to see the progression. Figure 10.6 shows you the division of HR responsibilities tied to performance appraisals. You have the HR unit and managers. The unit is going to design and maintain the system, train the raters. Those are the ones who are actually going through the process, right? Track the receipt of those appraisals and making sure that they're timely administered, and reviewing all appraisals that have been completed for consistency, making sure that everyone is, all the checks and balances are there. Managers are usually the raters. They're going to rate the performance of employees. They will prepare the formal appraisal documents, review those appraisals with the employees, and then identify development areas. So it is key, it is important, it is vital that the HR unit and managers are working hand in hand. Because can you see how if they're not, you can create a huge wedge, and you can also mess up the data and mess up how you go about assessing whether or not performance is up to par or not. So who conducts these? I've already mentioned it, but let's go over it again. Here are some various sources. I mentioned the supervisors, which are the managers that can rate employees. Employees can also rate their superiors. Some organizations don't do it, but I think it's important that you have it. It's important to get that feedback to see how well you're doing as a manager in supporting your team. Team members can rate each other. I think that's vital. Oftentimes organizations don't have that. Employees can rate themselves. I think that is very key, especially if the standards of rating are clear and not overinflated, where someone who is pompous and arrogant can always say that they are 10 out of 10 when they should be more like a 7 out of 10 or a 5 out of 10. And then, of course, you can have outside sources rate employees. Those could be customers. Those could be vendors. And then the multi-source or 360-degree feedback, which looks at the manager, customers, you, the employee, your, any subordinates, and any coworkers or peers. And all of these sources are now appraising you. That is the 360-degree approach. It's multiple sources. So we have some scaling methods, category scaling methods, and the graphic rating scale allows the rater to mark an employee's performance on a continuum that will indicate a low to high level of a specific characteristic. So based on a characteristic, that person is ranked low to high of where they stand. It can, of course, have various aspects such as descriptive categories, job duties, and any kind of behavioral dimensions. There are some concerns with this, though. And of course, the form might not accurately reflect the importance of certain job characteristics. Factors may need to be added or removed depending on the employee. Certain things just aren't applicable. Certain things should be applicable. It should focus should be on the job duties and the responsibilities. Sometimes people are doing these ratings and it has nothing to do with the person's job duties and responsibilities. And group traits can be rated differently by different supervisors. Lastly, descriptive words have different interpretations, so understanding that what I may interpret can be different based on what you interpret. So there should always be some kind of glossary of this terminology that is then properly trained for the raters to understand what those words actually mean or should mean. Here's a sample of some defining standards, right? Outstanding. The person is so successful at this job criterion that special note should be made and performance ranks in the top 10%. Exceeds expectations, meets expectations. They're below expectation. They're slightly below the minimum. And then unsatisfactory is that you're well below. And whether the person can improve to meet the minimum standards is questionable. This person, if honestly, training intervention should take place the moment they fall below the moment they reach that below expectations, below 3. So the 2.5, right? Below 3, you really need to have an intervention. When you reach 1, that means there's not enough touch of that manager. And I would say with myself as well, as your instructor, as I've always said, I'm trying to track with you before you fall below a C. When you reach an F, it has a lot to do with me as well, because I didn't intervene enough. Now, if by chance you're just ignoring my emails and my phone calls, then you're just ignoring me. But the moment you fall from a C to a D, that's below expectations. And that's where I'm needing to intervene. And that's usually what I try to do. Usually students who pay attention jump right back into it. Those that ignore me or whatever usually fall below. But within the workplace, it should be the same kind of touch point. I truly believe that if managers are not tracking with their team members every week, it should at least be every 2 weeks. What I mean by tracking is to literally sit down and say, or come to their workstation and say, how are you doing? Do you have any questions about anything? Do you have any problems? Is there anything I need to see? How are you doing as far as meeting standards? Are you going to be on target for this week's goal, this month's goal, this quarter's goal? See what I mean? Weekly meetings are also vital in that, because either before, after, or during the meeting, you can address certain concerns. So BARS is our behaviorally anchored rating scale that describes specific examples of behavior on the job that are then anchored or measured against a scale of performance levels, excuse me. How do we go about creating this system? You have to identify important job dimensions, write short statements of the behaviors that you'd like to see exhibited. Those are the anchors. Then assign them to job dimensions and then set scales for those anchors so that you can see where someone rates on one end of the scale to the other. So here is an example for customer service skills for a CSR from outstanding to unsatisfactory. You can see it outstanding, which is a 5. You use positive phrases to explain a product. Unsatisfactory is you argued with the customer about suitability of a requested product. Comparative methods, we can rank. You can list employees from highest to lowest in performance levels and relative contributions. This sometimes can be, this could be a bad one. There's some drawbacks because it does not indicate the size of the differences in performance between employees. It also will imply that those that rank the lowest are unsatisfactory performers, and that may not be the case. And it becomes an unwieldy process if the group to be ranked is large. If you have a large group, 25, 50, 100 people in a group, that rank, that scale is detrimental. It's just a disaster. It's just is not, it could be very bad. So that group needs to be a small group to make that work, to rank them in order like that. Another thing to consider under comparative methods is our force distribution. That's where you rate employees' performance levels, and those are distributed along what is considered a bell-shaped curve. And there are some advantages and disadvantages to this. An advantage would be that it helps to deal with rater inflation. That's where you have the rater who, through their own bias, inflates their score. A disadvantage is that managers resist placing people in the lowest or highest groups. Explanation for placement can be difficult. When you're having to explain why you put a person in a certain rank, it can be difficult. However, an advantage is that it can make managers identify high, average, and low performers. Here's the visual of the bell-shaped curve. You have your number of employees, and then you have the rating from 1 to 5, and you can see where 10% is unsatisfactory on the low end, and 10% on the other end of the curve is outstanding, and 40% right there is meeting expectations of a score of 3. So 1 is at unsatisfactory, 5 outstanding, meeting expectations right there in the middle at 3. And you can see where 40% of their employees met expectations. And you see that. So, narrative methods. We have our critical incident, where you keep a written record of highly favorable and unfavorable employee actions. This requires great detail. This requires, and for me, I stress that there's some advantages and disadvantages to this. And one can be that if you're biased against this person, you may find yourself writing more unfavorable records than favorable. This is then reviewed annually as part of an evaluation. And there's an essay that can also be written, a short essay that describes an employee's performance. The drawback is that if your writing skills aren't up to par, or you're not really good at expressing yourself, it could be very limited, which can reflect negatively on that employee. MBO, we've talked about this before, management by objectives, and this is an appraisal method that highlights the performance goals that you have and your manager has with you, and you identify these goals together. You sit down and outline what those goals are, how you will benchmark them, track them, and achieve them. Some stages would be a job review and agreement, development of those standards, setting the objectives, and then having continual discussions on how well you're performing. There are some combination of methods. No single appraisal method is best for all situations, right? There's no one fits all, size fits all. Performance measurement system that uses a combination of methods may be sensible. And as a manager, you can choose and mix methods to accomplish what you want your performance appraisal system to um, reflect. Training managers in performance appraisal. This is huge because there's various training topics that you can have, such as appraisal process and timing, positive and negative feedback, compensation reviews, common rating errors. So there's different topics that can be utilized. The types of errors that raters are known to have. Standards vary. There's recency and primacy effects, central tendency, leniency, and strictness, rater bias, as I've mentioned earlier, halo and horns effects, contrast error, similar to me errors, or they're different from me errors, and sampling errors. You can read more about that in your textbook as well. Appraisal feedback. You're getting feedback and there's an interview. So you're going to communicate the employee's positive contributions, discuss to enable them to identify their own deficiencies and develop improvement plans so that they can do better, be better, feel better. And of course, there's some reactions tied to this. Typically, there's negative perceptions of appraisals. Most of us cringe when we think about them. There's avoidance of negative issues or biased ratings due to a fear of confrontation or having to defend your decision. And well done appraisals are often viewed as constructive. So those are very important. In the interview, there's some hints, do's and don'ts. You should prepare before the interview, focus on an objective performance, be specific about the ratings and feedback, develop a future improvement plan, and reinforce their successes so that they can continue doing well. What you don't do is talk too much. You don't lecture them, berate them. You don't focus entirely on any negative job performance. You don't think the employee always has to agree with you because they don't. They're humans, not puppets. And you never, ever, ever compare the employee with others. They're their own unique self doing their own job with their own skills, their own strengths, their own weaknesses. So you never do that. When giving appraisal feedback, effective performance management focuses on the key understanding that it's a beneficial development tool. It's useful as an administrative tool. There are some legal and job-related factors to consider, and that it should be effective in documenting employee performance and being very clear who are your high, average, and low performers. That's all that should come back through that appraisal. As I already mentioned, you know who the high, average, and low performers are, so that performance is made clear. And it should be viewed fair by employees and making sure that you're documenting the performance effectively. So with that, that is the end of chapter 10. If you have any questions, please email me. Thank you.